Of all the massive volcanoes in New Zealand, Mount Ngauruhoe has erupted more often than any other since man's been around to take notice. There are at least half a dozen other pauses around the country just as dangerous as this. Just the same, I hope Mount Ngauruhoe doesn't wake up, not just now anyway. It's impressive enough when you're there, standing on the very edge of the crater. But that's something few people do. Most New Zealanders, in fact, never worry for a moment about the menace the mountain still represents. But if you were living in Napier in 1931, you'd need no further reminder of how restless these islands are. On February the 3rd, Napier was struck by the most disastrous earthquake New Zealand has known. More than 250 people died there. English sailors in port at the time were the first to bring out the dead. In 1979, New Zealand soldiers moved in on a rescue operation in a South Island city.
And we were sitting having a little drink at the kitchen table and the light shone through the window and they said, out. So we just sort of picked up ourselves and came.
The next was some of the old out power wires. And the power wires were snapping off before the lamppost being pulled out of the ruddy ground. So the first thing to do was get everybody out and just stand there and watch the whole place be torn apart.
The residents of Abbotsford in Dunedin at least had some warning. The hillside on which they lived had shown signs of movement throughout the previous wet winter. But they never expected their homes to slide away overnight down the slope, collapsing as they went. Some escaped relatively unscathed. Others weren't so lucky and lost almost all they had. No one, thank goodness, died. The hillside had been unstable even before the first house was built on it. But unlike Napier, this was no instant act of God. Man, as well as nature, had a finger in this unhappy pie. None of the devastation may have occurred if the foot of the slope had not been excavated to make way for a motorway. In New Zealand, man's never been able to resist the temptation to interfere with nature, and he does it in so many ways. What could be more harmless or more difficult than choosing a potted plant for the patio? Yet planting a shrub is another way of interfering with the natural order of things. Like the pioneers, we're not content to settle for what nature provided in New Zealand. Like them, we still prefer to create our own environment by planting out trees and shrubs and flowers from all over the world. The family that created this garden did exactly the same thing and for much the same reasons. But they'd at least 100 years start on the rest of us. The runholder who designed this garden was a young lawyer from Devon, Charles Tripp. In 1857, he came to the high country of South Canterbury. When he finally settled here at Orari Gorge, it was a lonely wilderness of tussock and scrub. What Tripp wanted around him was a corner of Devon or Cornwall. And what he got was something pretty close to that, and something that the people of South Canterbury still enjoy. I'd have done the same thing myself if I'd been here at that time, and especially if, like Charles Tripp, I was about to marry and to bring here the daughter of the Bishop of Christchurch. He put trout in this stream for her, and he spent 15 shillings a head, that's $1.50, on thrushes and blackbirds and yellowhammers to release here. What a pity it was they all turned out to be cocks. Charles Tripp wasn't the only enthusiastic meddler. He was simply one of the first. And who can blame them? They'd come to a completely alien land. There were few flowers, they had little colour. There wasn't a tree, not a shrub, not a plant of any kind that they knew. The only animals were a strange dog and an unfamiliar rat. So they brought in both plants and animals. At first, ones they knew from England, but soon they were bringing them from every corner of the world. The trouble was, they used very little discrimination, and they just didn't know when to stop. The settlers brought them in not only for sentimental reasons, but also for sport. Again, it's very easy to understand. Hunting made a pleasant change from the hard slog that the pioneers faced. When he'd been here nearly 30 years, Charles Tripp took his family on holiday to Lake Wakatipu. Looking through the window during the train trip through central Otago, he got the shock of his life. Rabbits were everywhere. Tripp had never seen so many rabbits. There were thousands and thousands of them at a glance. Central Otago was alive with them. The plague of rabbits he saw that day in 1881 was the first and most dramatic sign that here man the meddler had bitten off more than he could chew. Between central Otago, where the rabbits were, and Tripp's home at Orari Gorge in South Canterbury, was the natural boundary of the Waitaki River, which the rabbits had not yet crossed in force. Tripp realized that the barrier would soon be broken, that rabbits would surge across the river in their thousands. Tripp was so concerned that he started to do something at once. He'd always been an avid letter writer, but now he wrote thousands alerting Canterbury run holders to the impending danger. The run holders of central Otago were delighted to have Tripp's support. Each year, more and more of their land was becoming bare as hordes of rabbits ate out the last of the tussock grasses. Sheep numbers and wool production were falling, and the settlers' dream of a new life was fast becoming a nightmare. To halt the invasion of South Canterbury, Tripp's solution was to build fences. Fences like this. Tripp's persistent efforts persuaded the government to build one, 120 kilometers long, just north of the Waitaki River. but it never really worked. It was flattened by boulders careering down steep slopes, and wherever it crossed creeks, it was washed out in floods. Rabbits regularly burrowed underneath it and climbed snowdrifts piled against it in winter. 10 years later, Tripp had to petition for another fence. This time it was 270 kilometers long, and they built it a few kilometers still further north. It was, in a sense, a confession of the failure of the first one. Rabbit fences slowed the invasion of Canterbury, but didn't really stop it. That's only the first chapter in the story of the rabbit in New Zealand, but it's one that had to be rewritten for a whole succession of both plants and animals brought here by man. Once rabbits became established over most of the country, it was simply a matter of learning to live with them. Numbers, though, had to be kept down, usually by poisoning, if pastoral farming was to survive. But the men whose job it was to keep the rabbit population in check soon found there was a good market around the world for their skins. So it's hardly surprising that professional rabbiters always made sure that however many rabbits they killed, they always left enough to ensure a good catch the following year. The rabbit hunters were, in effect, rabbit farmers. This state of affairs lasted for nearly half a century, until World War II, when the rabbiters were called away to battle on the other side of the world. Without any check on their numbers, the rabbits now multiplied enormously. Much more drastic action was called for. The action became known as the killer policy. After the war, deadlier poisons were employed, and now they were dropped from the air. Freelance rabbiters were replaced by men on wages. They were employed by statutory rabbit boards created specifically to eliminate the problem of rabbits. And in another equally important move, rabbits were decommercialized. The sale of rabbit skins or of carcasses within New Zealand or for export was forbidden. The killer policy worked so well that in some districts the rabbit boards ran out of work and turned to other pests like opossums and goats. But rabbits have not been exterminated, nor has the damage they did to the vegetation been completely healed.
When Charles Tripp and his fellow runholders first came into the high country, these ranges were thickly carpeted with tussock. Today, you'd be lucky or unlucky, depending on your point of view, to see a rabbit here, and the vegetation is slowly coming back. Yet it was the damage done by rabbits, so thoughtlessly introduced, that large parts of this country remain virtually desert, man-made desert. This is no man-made forest, and man's had nothing at all to do with the creation of this native forest environment at Puriora in the King Country. North Island forests like this require frequent and abundant rain. Forests and rain go together, and together they build the soil. Outside now, it's pouring down, but all this vegetation intercepts and breaks the fall of the rain so that very little of it actually reaches the surface directly. And on the surface here, the vegetation does something else. It's building a layer of decaying organic matter that's just like a giant sheet of blotting paper, absorbing all the moisture that does reach the surface. Look here. This is just like a sponge. So that in here, even on the steepest slopes, practically none of the moisture actually runs off. But outside there, it's a different story. Here the bush has been cleared, as it had to be, I suppose, because the clearing of the bush has been the making of the New Zealand we know today. Just look what clearing the bush does to the land. That blanket of blotting paper has gone, and now the rain falls directly onto the soil. Most of it runs off and carries the precious topsoil with it.
Not only topsoil, but whole hillsides have slipped away. Even before the native forest was stripped off, the hill country of Hawke's Bay and of the east coast was geologically unstable. The slightest interference provoked nature into immediate retaliation. When city suburbs slide away, it becomes a national disaster. In the hill country, we take little notice. To the farmer and county councils, though, the cost can be a real burden.
"40 years ago, I was a young university teacher at Canterbury University College in Christchurch. At the time, I was exploring the North Island and drove along this very road in a car much like this one. I'd only been in New Zealand a couple of years, but I thought I'd got to know the geography of the country pretty well. I'd read all about the Napier earthquake 9 years before, and people indeed were still talking about a succession of disastrous floods along the east coast of the North Island in the previous 2 or 3 years.
But none of that, and certainly nothing in my English experience, prepared me for what I was about to see when I got out of the car. It was the Tarndale Slip in the headwaters of the Waipoa River behind Gisborne. Probably the world's most glaring example of this type of soil erosion, caused directly by man. Pictures taken at that time were published in a book I wrote on soil erosion. It was widely reviewed when it was published in 1945 and caused quite a stir. I like to think it went some way at least to awaken New Zealanders to the dangers of soil erosion. When I first came here, the whole countryside was crumbling into the riverbeds. Not just the Tarndale Slip, but scores of others lower down on both sides of all the tributary valleys. Today, those scars have healed. Trees have stabilized the slopes. Only Tarndale itself is still spewing its shingle into the valley. At Tarndale, there's no indication yet that man can stop what he started. Damage wasn't confined to erosion in the headwaters. Downstream, it took another form.
What's happened here in the 40 years since I first drove that car along the top of the Tarndale Slip would normally take thousands of years. Yet At the turn of the century, this expanse of riverbed just didn't exist. The original rainforest still mantled all these slopes, and the Waipoa was a clear stream in a narrow valley 30 meters below where I'm standing now. As soon as the settlers cleared the bush, the greasy grey rock on the hillsides began to crumble. There was nothing now to slow the runoff of rain. Storm rains became raging torrents that carried the shattered debris downstream. Beneath me here, it buried a wool shed and sheep yards and the small paddocks alongside under millions of tons of debris. In no time at all, nature had taken its revenge.
How much harsher that revenge would have been were it not for the pines that the Forest Service has planted. Their roots hold the hillsides fast, anchoring again the soil to the slopes. Without the pines, the river flats all the way down to the sea would have been at risk from increasingly frequent and devastating floods. Without the pines, they might by now have deserved the name Poverty Bay that Cook bestowed more than 200 years ago. Instead, the Poverty Bay Flats are just about the richest pocket of lowland in New Zealand. Evidence of the damage caused by soil erosion had been staring New Zealand in the face for years. When floods inundated the farms of Poverty Bay in the 1930s, people were still blaming the weather. Of course, heavy rains did play a part, but the real source of these disasters lay in the headwaters of the rivers, at places like Tarndale. Man had interfered, and nature was fighting back.
The only government department interested in doing something about it was the Department of Public Works. The minister at that time, Bob Semple, was always keen to find jobs for the bulldozers that he'd recently introduced from the United States, and for his engineers. But to Semple, the only answer was to build higher and higher stop banks.
But even with bulldozers, there's a limit to how high you can build stop banks and to how effective they are in a major flood. No matter how high you build them, they'll always be overtopped until you do something to stop the ever-increasing volumes of water pouring down from the hills. At best, Semple's river control bill would have been but a temporary palliative, never a cure.
That the bill never became law was due most of all to one man. He was lecturer in agriculture at the Teachers' College in Christchurch and a friend of mine. He taught me, in fact, more about New Zealand plants and their story than anyone else. His name was Lance McCaskill.
Mac was a conservationist long before conservation was fashionable. There were very few parts of the country that he didn't know at first hand. He'd seen soil erosion was tearing the country to bits. Mac was a teacher. He used black and white slides more effectively than anyone I've known. His message was simple. This is what's happening to your country. The Rivers Control Bill won't fix it. Keeping the soil where it belongs will. Mac took his travelling slideshow to Parliament, where it persuaded MPs that a broader bill was needed. One providing not only for rivers control on the plains, but also for soil conservation back in the hills. The hill country of the North Island east coast is still littered with the logs and stumps of a native forest. A forest that was diverse and dense and grew in disorganized profusion. But today, a single species is being planted in its place. Planted in regimented rows. And the remarkable thing is that this tree is another alien. It's an exotic pine brought here to this land of trees from across the ocean.
If you think you're a long way from New Zealand, you're right. But there is a link, and it's an important one, because this is Fisherman's Wharf at Monterey on the coast of California.
Fisherman's Wharf is a famous tourist attraction. But within sight of the wharf is something else, something that touches the lives of practically all New Zealanders.
This is no man-made plantation, because this is the home of Pinus radiata, and here it grows naturally. The origin of the millions and millions of pine trees planted in New Zealand is right here in California. They derive ultimately from 4 small localities, all of them close to the Monterey Peninsula.
In these native Californian forests, the pines grow untended, unpruned, and untidily. Trees of all ages grow together. And the one thing you must never do with a Monterey pine in Monterey is cut it down, not even a dead one. You can't even prune one back from your own house without a permit from the city authorities. Nobody knows just how or when the Monterey pine got to New Zealand.
But it's my guess that it first crossed this ocean when some gold miner slipped a pine cone or a packet of pine seeds into his swag after the famous gold rushes in California in 1849. And like hundreds of other prospectors, he sailed first for the gold fields in Victoria and then for the diggings in Otago.
At Naseby in central Otago, there are Monterey pines that were planted by miners when Naseby was a booming gold town in the early 1860s. In New Zealand, the Monterey pine proved easier to grow, and it grew more rapidly than any other tree. By the 1870s, shelter belts of pine began to crisscross the open tussock of the Canterbury Plains.
Meantime, in the North Island, the native trees were fast disappearing, not only to make way for farms, but to provide timber for export, for the settlers' houses, for bridges, and later for butter boxes.
The most sought-after tree was the lordly kauri. From the earliest days of settlement right through to the Second World War, milling native timber was an important industry. But the amount of timber taken out was nothing compared to what went up in smoke. But no matter how the forest was removed, for a long time, few people gave any thought to what would happen when the native forest had gone.
In 1919, the State Forest Service was established, and it was its first director, another import from North America, a Canadian forester, who got down to the job of working out just what had to be done. It didn't take William McIntosh Ellis long to do his sums. One brutal calculation said it all. At the present rate, there wouldn't be a stick of timber left to mill in another 40 years. He recommended a crash planting program using exotic trees on land that then was no good at all for farming. Follow this plan of mine, said Ellis to the government, and the country will have timber enough by 1965. But planting didn't start in earnest until 2 years after Ellis had left for Australia. It was 1930 then, and by that time what appealed to the politicians was that planting trees would solve another problem, a more immediate one, the growing numbers of unemployed. But the only tree seed readily available at that time was Pinus radiata.
So it was that the largest man-made forest in the world began as a relief measure. Nothing more than what seemed like a good idea at the time for finding jobs. The project didn't really deserve to succeed. Were all planted at much the same time and would mature together. They were nearly all of one species, and the quality of the timber of that species was unknown. Certainly, it was unsuitable for the pulp and paper technology available at the time. All we knew then was that the Monterey pine grew fast in New Zealand and with little trouble. Two things helped the forest turn out trumps. One was the development of chemical methods of preserving timber, tannalizing, and the other was a better pulping technique that could handle the resinous pine. For 100,000 New Zealanders or more, pine trees mean income and a livelihood. For them, Pinus radiata is far more familiar than any native tree.
New Zealanders now realize that a great deal of their country's future is bound up with these enormous forests and the timber they produce. But just like the meddlers who cut down the native forest at Tarndale and elsewhere in the North Island, the men responsible for planting these trees had little idea what the consequences of their action would be. This time, though, we've been lucky. So far,
it's turned out to be a tremendously profitable gamble. Outside our cities, the Kaingaroa State Forest is one of the most impressive landmarks man has made in New Zealand.
don't know who it was first brought this here. Somebody told me it was the missionaries. Whoever it was, though, they've got a lot to answer for, because gorse is the worst weed we have in New Zealand. Like Pinus radiata, gorse grows far better here than it ever did where it came from. It was planted first in New Zealand by early settlers as an ornamental garden shrub and also as a hedge plant.
Plants for hedges. 10,000 sweetbriar, 10,000 firs, gorse or whin. Agricultural seeds, 100 weight firs, gorse or whin. W. Wilson, nursery and seedsman.
Of Canterbury had no timber handy for making fences. So until galvanized wire came to New Zealand, they dug ditches and built banks alongside on which they planted gorse plants by the thousand. The only trouble was that unless the gorse was trimmed, it spread into paddocks and into the road alongside. But in the hill country, and especially in the damp climates of the North Island, gorse couldn't be trimmed. It ran wild. And it couldn't even be controlled until aircraft became available to shower lethal weed killers, including 2,4,5-T, from the air. Despite such sophisticated technology, the nation's capital remains under threat of invasion by gorse.
I'd have preferred to have used 2,4,5-T on this lot. It's much simpler than chopping it down, but this gorse is too close to these young pine trees. We'll never be able to estimate the cost of the trouble that gorse has caused us, and we're not finished with it yet by any means. Again, it's something we brought upon ourselves by meddling with the environment. The irony is that left to itself, nature would handle this gorse far more efficiently than the axe or chemical poisons.
If we ever locked up New Zealand for 40 years or more and let the native bush come back, neither the gorse nor any of the aliens we've introduced would stand a chance. Today, truly virgin native forest is pretty hard to find, especially near sea level. We find it only where the land is impossible to farm and stands virtually on end. Yet even here, in the gorge of the Motu River, inland from the Bay of Plenty, man's reach has penetrated. Man himself directly has left no mark. Indirectly, though, despite the isolation, his impact has been felt even here. The goats and deer he introduced have gone wild. Now they're destroying the forest undergrowth. The slopes are becoming bare, and the rocks starting to crumble and tumble into the river below. Captain Cook brought the first animal pest to New Zealand by sea. These days, alien invaders have a choice of transport. Today, jet aircraft arrive in New Zealand regularly from places that ships never came from. But we just don't know what new threat they might bring. They could have on board, for example, disease-carrying insects or dangerous viruses and bacteria. And we don't know what plant diseases there might be in East Asia that, if introduced here, could devastate a bonanza crop like kiwi fruit. Now, though, we've made it difficult for the meddlers to act as irresponsibly as they did for more than 100 years. But it's still difficult to control pests. Pests that could be even more dangerous to New Zealand than gorse and goats and rabbits. The most dangerous pest that could be turned loose in New Zealand would be a disease of domestic livestock that could ruin the New Zealand economy. The risks are so great that for 20 years from 1952, the government wouldn't allow anyone to bring sheep to New Zealand. In 1972, it relented and imported 4 new breeds. Normal quarantine wasn't enough. Mana Island off the coast of Wellington was set aside as a special security farm. Today, you still need a permit just to visit Mana Island. And they make you wear special clothing that you leave behind when you go. The intention was to establish on Mana Island the most fertile sheep in the world and to cross them with the New Zealand Romney. The imports themselves would never leave Mana, only their offspring. If it worked, there would be from 10 to 15 million more lambs to export from New Zealand each year. From England came the Oxford Down. From Germany, the East Frisian and the Oldenburg. But most important of all was a breed from the Baltic called the Finn, a breed so prolific that it has a litter of as many as 5 or 6 lambs at a time. But in 1976, an isolated case of the dreaded virus disease, scrapie, was found in one of the East Frisian ewes. Only one thing could be worse: foot and mouth disease. As a precaution, all the sheep of that breed and all their crossbred offspring were destroyed. But on the mainland, as far away from anyone as possible, on the volcanic plateau at Crater Block, the experiment continued. Here they'd established several hundred crossbred ewes. For 2 years the flocks increased with not a sign of scrapie. It looked as if all the elaborate precautions were paying off after all. until in the midwinter of 1978, the dreaded scrapie showed up again, this time in the crossbreds at Crater Block.
That was it. Every sheep in that experiment, both here at Crater Block and back there on Mana Island, now had to be destroyed. The scrapie virus had obviously come to New Zealand with the new breeds. And to slaughter every sheep and burn or bury every carcass was the only way to be sure of getting rid of it. The latest large-scale attempt to meddle, no matter how expensive, no matter how carefully controlled, no matter how thoroughly justified it was, had simply backfired.
Just as sheep have gone from Mana Island, they've gone too from Crater Block. Since sheep are not allowed here, that pine from Monterey has been planted. And the soil in which they grow is ash from that volcano up there. Tarawera split wide open in 1886 without warning. The Mana Island Crater Block experience indicates how much of our future, for better or worse, is for us to decide. Tarawera is a sobering reminder that the last word lies always with nature.